The forest was my sanctuary, a place where the weight of daily life could be set aside, even if just for a while. That afternoon, the world seemed perfectly in tune. The sun filtered through the trees, painting the ground with delicate patterns of light and shadow. The soft murmur of a breeze carried with it the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was the kind of day that invited solitude, a quiet escape from the relentless pace of responsibilities at home. I had walked this trail countless times before, but today felt different. The forest seemed to beckon me with an unusual intensity, urging me deeper into its embrace. The sounds of the house, footsteps, muffled voices, faded behind me as the gentle rustling of leaves and occasional bird calls took over. It was a silence that felt alive, not empty, and I welcomed it wholeheartedly. Following an unmarked path, I wandered farther than usual, letting instinct guide me. The towering trees created a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft green hues. Eventually, I stumbled upon a clearing where a fallen log beckoned me to rest. The space was idyllic, untouched by anything but nature's hand. I sat down, letting the peacefulness seep into my bones. For a long while, I closed my eyes, listening to the symphony of the forest. The stillness felt like a gift, a chance to exhale. But then, a sound broke the quiet. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but it grew steadily closer. My heart quickened as I opened my eyes, scanning the surrounding trees. To my surprise, Daniel, my stepson, stood just a few paces away, partially hidden by the underbrush. His presence startled me, not because it was unwelcome, but because I had never known him to venture this deep into the woods. He hesitated as if unsure whether to approach, his expression one of mild surprise. "Daniel," I said, finding my voice after a moment. "I didn't expect to see anyone else out here." He stepped closer, his hand brushing the bark of a nearby tree as though grounding himself. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, his tone unusually soft. "I was walking and saw you. I thought I'd check if you were okay." His explanation was simple, but his tone carried a weight I couldn't quite place. Daniel had always been polite, kind even, but our interactions were largely surface level, shaped by the formal distance often found in step-family dynamics. Yet today, something felt different. "I don't mind," I replied, gesturing to the log beside me. "The forest is better with company sometimes." He smiled faintly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face as he sat down. The space between us felt smaller than it should have been, but I dismissed the thought, determined not to disrupt the moment with overanalysis. "Do you come here often?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the clearing. I nodded. "This is my refuge when life feels overwhelming. It's a place to think, to find some quiet." He seemed to absorb my words, his brow furrowed slightly in thought. I studied him briefly, noticing how much he had changed. The boy I had met years ago had grown into a confident young man, his features sharp yet softened by a quiet introspection. "It's beautiful," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can see why you come here." Our eyes met, and for a fleeting moment I felt a warmth that startled me. It wasn't just the familiarity of a shared space, it was something deeper, an unspoken understanding that made the air between us feel charged. I looked away quickly, focusing on the shafts of sunlight breaking through the trees. This was Daniel, my stepson. My feelings were simply the product of an emotionally charged moment. Weren't they? We sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the forest filling the space between us. Birds chirped overhead, and the breeze rustled the leaves in a soothing rhythm. It felt like we had stepped into a world separate from our own, untouched by the expectations and routines waiting for us at home. After a long pause, Daniel spoke again. "I've always admired how you handle everything," he said quietly. "With Dad working so much, you keep everything at home running so smoothly." "I don't think I've ever told you that." His words caught me off guard. I turned to him, startled by the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you, Daniel," I said softly. "That means a lot." He smiled, and for the first time, it felt less guarded. There was a gentleness in his expression that I hadn't noticed before. The atmosphere between us shifted again, growing heavier with unspoken emotions. I wondered if he felt it too, the strange pull that neither of us seemed able to name. "Do you ever feel like you're playing a role?" he asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Like you're expected to be one thing, but deep down, you're someone else entirely?" His question struck a chord. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I think we all do, in a way. It's easy to lose sight of who we are beneath everyone's expectations." He nodded slowly, his expression pensive. "I've been feeling that a lot lately. Like I'm living someone else's life instead of my own." I wanted to comfort him, to offer reassurance, but the vulnerability in his voice left me momentarily speechless. "You're still figuring things out," I said finally. "You have time to decide who you want to be." When he looked at me, his eyes were filled with a gratitude that made my chest tighten. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't think I've ever talked about this with anyone before." For a while, we sat in silence, our thoughts swirling in the quiet. Then, in a gesture that was both innocent and deeply personal, he placed his hand on mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a ripple of emotion through me. I should have pulled away, re-established the boundaries that kept our relationship defined. But something about the moment held me in place, the sincerity in his eyes, the unspoken connection that seemed to anchor us to this spot in the woods. "Daniel," I began, my voice barely audible, but before I could say more, he withdrew his hand, breaking the spell. The cool air rushed in, and with it came a sharp awareness of the lines we had come close to crossing. "I should head back," I said, rising to my feet. My voice wavered, betraying the swirl of emotions I was trying to suppress. He stood as well, brushing leaves from his pants. "Yeah," he agreed, his expression unreadable. We walked back in silence, the bond we had shared in the clearing lingering in the air between us. As the forest thinned and the house came into view, I felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as though we were leaving something behind among the trees. That night, as I prepared dinner, my thoughts kept circling back to the woods. The warmth of his hand, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it was all burned into my memory, impossible to ignore. I tried to shake the feeling, to focus on the mundane tasks of cooking and tidying up. But the memory of that afternoon lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. Something had shifted between us, and I couldn't deny it. But what it meant, or what to do about it, remained as mysterious as the forest itself. The days following our encounter in the woods were a blur of routine, yet the memory of that moment clung to me like mist on a cold morning. I reassured myself it was inconsequential, a fleeting connection born of circumstance. Daniel was my stepson, after all, family. But despite my efforts to rationalize, the memory lingered, a quiet whisper in the corners of my mind. As I stood in the kitchen that evening, preparing dinner, I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw Daniel leaning casually against the doorframe, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. His small, almost hesitant smile met my gaze, but his eyes seemed to carry a weight that mirrored my own. "Need help?" he asked, gesturing toward the stove. Caught off guard, I hesitated before nodding. "Sure, you can dice those vegetables." I handed him a cutting board and a knife, and as he stepped closer, his arm brushed against mine, a brief, innocuous touch that felt oddly significant. We worked in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of his knife against the cutting board blending with the soft bubbling of the pot on the stove. I focused intently on stirring, willing myself not to look at him. Still, I was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth of him standing so near, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the aroma of herbs and spices. Finally, he broke the silence. "About the other day, in the woods." The words hung in the air, and I felt a faint heat rise to my cheeks. I busied myself wiping down the counter to avoid meeting his gaze. "Yes," I said, my tone carefully neutral. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly, the knife stilling in his hand. I don't know. It felt like we had a chance to talk. To actually connect." His honesty disarmed me. "I appreciated it," I said quickly, trying to sound casual. "It's nice to have moments like that where we can talk freely." Our eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting glance, there was something unspoken, an understanding we didn't dare put into words. He offered a small, thoughtful nod and turned back to his task. That evening, we sat down to dinner as usual. Robert asked about my day, and I recounted errands and chores, carefully avoiding any mention of the woods or Daniel's unexpected arrival there. I could feel Daniel's gaze on me at times, but I avoided meeting it, unsure what Robert might pick up on if he noticed the undercurrent of tension between us. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs to take a bath, hoping the warm water would help me relax. But as I sank into the tub, my mind replayed the events of the day. The memory of Daniel's hand on mine, the intensity in his eyes, it all came rushing back, as vivid as if it had just happened. In the following days, an unspoken tension settled between us. We moved around each other with polite smiles and brief exchanges, yet every interaction carried an undertone of something deeper, something neither of us could articulate. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the living room, Daniel came in and sat across from me. He seemed restless, his gaze flickering around the room before finally landing on me. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his tone unusually serious. I nodded, setting a folded shirt aside. "Of course." He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "Do you ever feel like there's more to life than this? Like there's something you've missed?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. "I think everyone wonders that sometimes," I said finally. "It's natural to think about the paths we didn't take, the lives we might have lived." He nodded thoughtfully, his expression pensive. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately," he admitted. "What I want, who I am. It's hard to figure it all out." "You don't have to have all the answers right now," I said gently. "You're young. You have time to figure things out." A small, rueful smile tugged at his lips. "I don't always feel young," he said, "especially when it comes to big decisions." I wanted to comfort him, to say something meaningful, but the vulnerability in his voice left me momentarily speechless. Instead, we sat in silence, the quiet stretching between us like a fragile thread. "Thank you," he said eventually, standing, "for listening." As he left the room, I felt a strange mix of relief and longing. I wanted to say more, to offer him reassurance, but the boundaries between us felt too precarious to risk crossing. The days that followed were filled with subtle shifts in our interactions. He lingered in the kitchen after dinner, asked me how my day had been with a quiet intensity, sat closer than usual during our family evenings. These moments, though small, felt charged, as though they carried a weight we couldn't quite name. One rainy afternoon, while Robert was away on a business trip, I found myself paging through an old photo album in the living room. The pictures brought back memories of vacations, holidays, and milestones, each one a snapshot of our shared history. Daniel walked in and paused at the doorway, watching me. Looking through the past, he asked with a soft smile, stepping closer. I nodded. "Just reminiscing. Time flies, doesn't it?" He sat beside me, leaning in to see the album. Together, we laughed over awkward haircuts and childhood antics, the conversation easy and light. But as the moments passed, that familiar tension crept back in. His arm brushed mine as he leaned closer, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne. I tried to focus on the photos, on the happy memories they captured. But when I glanced at him, his eyes met mine with a quiet intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. "Thank you for always being here," he said softly, his voice carrying an unexpected depth. The air between us felt thick, charged with emotions we didn't dare name. For a long moment, we simply sat there, the silence speaking louder than any words. And then, as though sensing the line we were approaching, I stood abruptly, closing the photo album. "I should get back to dinner prep," I said, my voice a little too bright. Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable, and I left the room, my heart pounding. The weight of our unspoken connection lingered heavily in the days that followed, though I resolved to bury it beneath layers of routine and obligation. Daniel was my stepson, and I reminded myself repeatedly that the line we had almost crossed was one we could never revisit. The guilt mingled with something more, an ache I didn't fully understand, but was determined to suppress. When I heard his quiet footsteps one evening as I folded laundry in the living room, my heart jumped, even as I scolded myself for the reaction. I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, his expression hesitant but resolute. "Diana," he began softly, his voice holding a weight I couldn't ignore. "I think we need to talk." I froze, clutching the towel in my hands as I met his gaze. I had anticipated this moment, knowing it was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. He stepped into the room and sat across from me, his posture tense yet composed. For a moment, silence stretched between us, thick with everything we hadn't said. "I want to apologize," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "for putting you in that position. I never should have let things get to that point." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "It wasn't just you, Daniel," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I let it happen too. We both did." His eyes flickered with pain, and he nodded slowly. "I don't want this to make things awkward between us. You're important to me, and I don't want to lose that." The sincerity in his words brought a bittersweet pang to my chest. "I don't want that either," I said softly. "But we need to move forward, to leave this behind us." For a brief moment, his gaze held mine, and I thought I saw regret flicker there. "I understand," he said finally, his voice steady but laced with sadness. "I'll keep my distance if that helps." I offered him a faint smile, one that I hoped conveyed both understanding and finality. "Thank you, Daniel," I said. As he left the room, the ache in my chest deepened. I was relieved that we had resolved the tension, but there was an undeniable emptiness in the space he left behind, a quiet longing for something that could never be. In the days that followed, our interactions became measured and polite, stripped of the warmth that had once defined them. We exchanged brief greetings, shared meals in silence, and focused on our respective routines. I poured myself into hobbies I had neglected over the years, setting up a small art studio in the sunroom and losing myself in the colors and textures of my paintings. At night, I often found myself sitting alone in the living room, a cup of tea in hand, staring at the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. My thoughts drifted to Robert, to the life we had built together, and to the quiet distance that had grown between us over the years. I resolved to rekindle our connection, to give our marriage the attention it deserved. One evening, as I worked on a landscape sketch by the window, Robert entered the room and sat beside me. His gaze lingered on my drawing, a mix of curiosity and admiration in his expression. "You've been spending a lot of time on this," he said with a small smile. "I didn't realize you still enjoyed it so much." I returned his smile, warmth spreading through me. "I think I forgot how much I missed it," I admitted. He reached out, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "I'm glad you found something that brings you joy, Diana," he said softly. His words touched something deep within me, stirring both gratitude and regret for the emotional distance that had crept into our relationship. From that day forward, I made a conscious effort to bridge the gap, initiating conversations, planning small outings, and creating moments for us to reconnect. It wasn't easy, and there were times when memories of Daniel threatened to pull me back into the turmoil of my own emotions. But I reminded myself of the stability and love that Robert offered, the foundation of the life we had built together. As the weeks turned into months, the intensity of my feelings for Daniel began to fade, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The memories of our time in the woods and those fleeting, charged moments became like distant echoes, a reminder of a chapter that had shaped me but no longer defined me. One crisp autumn afternoon, as I returned from a walk in the woods, I saw Daniel standing at the edge of the trees. His hands were in his pockets, his posture thoughtful. When he noticed me, he smiled faintly and stepped forward. "I thought I might find you here," he said. I nodded, my own smile tinged with nostalgia. "It's still my favorite place," I said quietly. We stood together in companionable silence, the golden light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a shared acknowledgement of the past and the choices we had made. "I just wanted to thank you," he said finally, his voice steady. "For everything. For being there for me, even when I didn't deserve it." Emotion welled in my throat, but I managed to smile. "You don't have to thank me, Daniel. You're family. I'll always be here for you." His eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, I saw a calmness in his expression. "That means a lot," he said. As he walked away, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. Whatever had passed between us, it had left its mark, but it had also taught me invaluable lessons about myself, about boundaries, and about the complexities of human connection. Life moved forward. Daniel pursued his own path, finding success and fulfillment in his endeavors. Robert and I rediscovered the love and partnership that had brought us together in the first place, building a stronger foundation for our future. I continued to paint, finding solace and joy in the creative process. The woods remained my sanctuary, a place where I could reflect and find inspiration. The memories of that time with Daniel stayed with me, but they no longer held the same weight. Instead, they became a part of my journey, a reminder of the importance of self-awareness, authenticity, and choice. Ultimately, I learned that love isn't always about holding on. Sometimes it's about letting go, finding peace in the journey, and embracing the beauty of the present. And in that acceptance, I found a contentment that was more than enough.